All right, welcome to Portland Sustainability Series. We're really excited to have the Governor's Office on Policy Innovation and the Future here, the Climate Council, to present. Thank you all for being here, and now I'm going to kick it off to our presenters to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much for having us. My name is Anthony Ronzio. I'm Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future. I am in charge of GoPIF's sort of communications and external affairs and a variety of different duties for our office, with one of our big projects being the Maine Climate Council. And I'm going to let my colleague Brian to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Tony. Good evening. My name is Brian Ambrett. I'm the Senior Climate Resilience Coordinator with the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future. I'm one of 3 staff members for the Climate Council, and have helped with a number of the working groups over the last 8 months, which we're going to be telling you about tonight. And also leading up some pilot projects and community projects that we hope to get off the ground in the coming months.
Thanks, Brian. We're really happy here to talk to you about the Climate Council tonight. I know we've got at least one member of the Climate Council in the audience tonight who was part of 2 half-day Zoom meetings last week that were the latest quarterly meeting of the Climate Council that saw the council hear a series of really thoughtful and high-level recommendations from a series of working groups that have worked over the last 9 months to come up with some draft strategies for addressing climate change in Maine. And so tonight, what we're going to do very quickly is an overview that I'll take you through a little bit about who our office is and kind of a top-level view of the council. Brian, who is Climate Council staff, will take you through a little bit as a council insider. Full disclosure, I've been with GoPIF now for 3 months, and so I haven't had as depth of exposure to the Climate Council as Brian has. So Brian's going to give you that insider view. And then we'll follow up at the end with a little bit about our summer public engagement around the Climate Council recommendations, and then also a little bit of a view of the next steps leading into the council's next meeting in September. Couple of disclosures from the beginning. I am not a climate scientist. I do not even play one on TV, but I do have a good sense of the process and can talk to anybody about how this whole Climate Council is working through. And then Brian is a specialist in climate resiliency, especially. But so there might be some questions tonight very specific on scientific topics or very deep climate related topics we may not be able to answer, but that's the point of why we're here. We're here to be able to tell you a little bit about our process, give you a peek into our process, but also hear the questions that need to be sort of answered and considered by the council as they go forward. So I look forward to that in the Q&A. So let me tell you a little bit about GoPIF and a little bit about where we start. I mean, we're here tonight because of Governor Mills. Governor Mills has made a look towards the future and climate change a focus of her administration. And so our office, GoPIF, was founded in 2019. We are a small but feisty group. There's about 8 of us that work as an adjunct to the governor's office on long-range policy initiatives, with climate change and the Maine Climate Council being primary part of that. In addition to climate, we work on economic development issues, we work on workforce issues, we work on opioid response issues, we work on children's issues through a really wonderful organization called the Maine Children's Cabinet that the governor formed. And so our eye as an office, as an entity, is really on making sure our focus is on the future of Maine, despite of whatever happens in front of us. And that is certainly a mission that has been tested over the past 3 months. I can say that with firsthand knowledge as someone that started a GoPIF on March 16th, which was the day after Governor Mills declared the state of civil emergency for COVID-19. And over the past 3 months, our office has worked very hard to keep our eyes on the future, and also with a lot of heart and a lot of strength towards the present. And I want to credit the Maine Climate Council for really adapting to that over the last 3 months. And so this was a process that started last year. It's a large process. Hundreds of people have devoted hours and time to be able to come up with the recommendations that we'll talk about later. And like so many of us, they adapted to a swift pivot to a virtual process in early March, and worked really tirelessly and really incredibly over the past 2 months to be able to stay on process and stay on deadline. to be able to continue the work and continue the focus on climate despite the sort of the global upheaval that we all did. And so they deserve a lot of credit for definitely doing that. So how is Maine tackling climate change? This is sort of a slide that speaks for itself. And really the Climate Council is a major part of that. So the Climate Council is an assembly of scientists, industry leaders, bipartisan state and local officials, and engaged citizens working to address the effects of climate change on the state. That is their core mission, that is their function. They are experts from a variety of walks of life, from a variety of Maine places and Maine people, with the goal of really coalescing around a series of strategies that can be vetted and implemented and discussed and used to put Maine on a trajectory to both reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from our state, to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, and really, and Brian can speak to this a little bit later, but really understand what Maine needs to do to be resilient to the changes that to what climate change is going to be doing to our state going forward. And so it's no small feat. And the council is working very diligently towards its goal. And one of the things it needs now, and one of the reasons that Brian and I are here, is that it's really time for the public to understand the work of the working groups and have an understanding of the thought and the scale and the trade-offs and the impacts of what the working groups are recommending, and then have a chance to weigh all those and give the council some actionable feedback for its consideration for the meeting it's going to have later on this year. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. I really love these points, and I wanted to highlight those to give everybody a sense of sort of the guiding principles that the Climate Council is using as it kind of evaluates all of the draft recommended strategies that came out of the working group process that we're going to talk about. These are the things. These are the North Stars. You know, the goals of the adaptation goals, the guiding principles: improve the resilience of Maine's people, prioritize the welfare of Maine's citizens, foster the value of the state's natural resources and natural resource industries, encourage diversity, inclusion, and equity in Maine communities and people. And we have an important point to bring up on that later on in the presentation. And then really have this be a data and scientific and science-driven process. I mean, there is so much information now about what climate is doing to Maine now, that it's an irrefutable truth that action needs to be taken. And data and science as a common language, you know, is something that we need to be able to convey, that these changes are coming to our state whether we like them or not, and that we need to be able to take some action. And that's also part of our work this summer, is kind of upping the education game, so people understand that the real present impacts of climate change are here, they are dangerous, and they have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed now. And so these are the big goals of the Climate Council. So again, first deliverable is a climate action plan that's coming on December 1st of 2020. And again, that's the big picture statutory deadline that was set forth for the Climate Council, to have a 4-year climate action plan delivered by December 1st. And, you know, I can say on March 15th, my first day with GoPIF, with all of the upheaval that was happening by COVID-19, that felt like a very tough deadline to meet. And then the resiliency of the Climate Council members and the process to be able to continue work, pivot to that all virtual process, stay on deadline to have their working group recommendations in last week, I think, you know, keeps us on track for this major milestone on December 1st, 2020. Another goal, climate goal of Maine, is achieving state carbon neutrality by 2045. That's something that Governor Mills promised to the United Nations in a speech last year. And it's something that the climate strategies and the stuff the working group recommendations are coming into has in mind as it goes, that we want to make Maine net zero carbon neutral by 2045. And then in statute are these 2 levels here. Reduce Maine's GHG emissions by the targets outlined in state law. So we want to be 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And again, big picture goal: ensure Maine people, industries, and communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change. And a quick bit of trivia that I think Brian taught me on an earlier call that we had maybe a few weeks ago. 1990 is a particularly is a benchmark year in climate science because, Brian?
That was the year that the Kyoto Treaty was enacted, and it serves as the baseline for a number of folks. Other common years are 2000, 2005, but 1990 is really when the world woke up and started taking a step towards doing something about climate change.
Gotcha. So there's thank you for that. I was wondering 1990 and Brian, because he's incredibly well versed in this science and in this work, knew the answer right off the top of his head. So that's the big picture tee up. I'm gonna hand it over to Brian now to kind of go through a little bit of the science and into the council workings itself, and then into a look at the recommendations that came out last week.
Thanks, Doug. So this slide is really the previous slide in a graphical form. It shows us where we've been with our greenhouse gas emissions as a state and where we need to get to over the next 30 years. You'll see that 1990 baseline there, and you'll see that emissions rose for about 15 years after 1990, after the Kyoto Protocol. But emissions in Maine peaked in 2002. And since then, we've been on the decline that you can see. We're actually down about 33% now from that peak in 2002. So we're moving in the right direction at a pretty good pace. And we're actually 17% below that 1990 baseline as of the data from 2015. So we're doing pretty well vis-a-vis that goal for 2020, which was to be 10% below. So we're ahead of our goal for 2020. And this is just, the yellow line is just a smooth line from here to the 80% goal in 2050. And that's the trajectory that we need to stay on for the next 30 years or do better than. Those are the goals right there. So this slide is the breakdown of where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from in the state of Maine. And you'll see that the lion's share is transportation and residential. To combine, those two make up about 3/4 of the emissions from in the state. Transportation, well over half. We're a rural state, so we have to drive farther than just about any other state. Despite being smaller than some of the western states, we do actually have longer distances that we drive per capita than even some of the western states. So we have a large nut to crack there on transportation. We also have a big nut to crack in residential. That's about 1/5 of our greenhouse gases in the state. And the lion's share of that comes from heating costs, building heating. Maine has the highest greenhouse gas emissions from building heating of any state in the country. So we've got a really big nut to crack there too. And you'll see that there's some attention paid to that by the council in the form of its working groups. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. On the plus side, with the heating question, we have a goal in Maine of installing 100,000 high-efficiency heat pumps by the year 2025, and we're making really good progress towards that goal. Maine actually already has the highest market penetration of heat pumps in the country out of any state. So we're doing really well on converting some of that residential and building heating to electrified heat sources and high-efficiency heat pumps. So we're doing pretty well. And then the remaining greenhouse gas sources are industrial processes. This is manufacturing and some of the larger industrial bases in the state, and electric power generation. So we have working groups that were addressing all of these areas. But as Tony said, there's been a process here underway since about this time last year when the governor signed the Maine Climate Council into law. And the council itself kicked off in September with an in-person meeting. And then since September, the working groups and the Science and Technical Committee have been meeting monthly and even more frequently than monthly to build recommendations to the council for how to tackle those greenhouse gas emissions and how to make the state more resilient to the effects of climate change that we know are coming regardless of what we do on the greenhouse gas emissions side. So just last week, the working groups presented those recommendations to a meeting of the Climate Council. That was a 2-day virtual meeting, 2 half days, and almost 7 hours worth of presentations and discussions between the working groups and the council members. And then we'll talk a little bit later on this evening about the process moving forward, but the end goal here in the near term is the Climate Council has to deliver a plan to the legislature and the governor on December 1st. So the workload has really shifted now from the 6 working groups over to the Climate Council members, who will be poring over the recommendations, grouping them, weighing them, evaluating costs and benefits and equity and a host of other criteria, and then making a coherent, cohesive set of recommendations to the council to keep Maine on that yellow pathway towards its greenhouse gas emissions goals and its resiliency goals. So as I said, there are 6 working groups on the council and a science and technical subcommittee. I should back up one step. There's 39 members on the council itself, and then all of these working groups and the science and technical subcommittee form additional almost 200 people. So there's a really broad base of involvement here on the council, and representing all sectors in Maine, and a lot of interests and constituency groups. So you can see the list here. I won't read them all to you, but we've covered a lot of the major areas of greenhouse gas emissions, and we've also covered a lot of the concerns on the resiliency and adaptation side of climate change. And we'll get a little bit into the details of what each of these groups were working on. So the Science and Technical Subcommittee was chaired by Ivan Fernandez, who I think is paying attention here tonight. Ivan is also a member of the Climate Council, so he's got a really important role as one of the state's leading experts on climate science. But the Science and Technical Subcommittee was really charged with making sure that this entire process was based in really sound science. And so the subcommittee was organizing and bringing all of the latest information on climate science, on the impacts of climate change, on the projections for climate change, on the greenhouse gas emissions, on carbon sequestration, and all of these into the room for the Climate Council to have at their fingertips. There's a really great Science and Technical Subcommittee Phase 1 report that's available on the GoPIF website, and we'll be sharing the links with you for that later this evening, which is, to call it a summary wouldn't do it justice. It's a really deep dive in the science and what the council members really need to know to be able to understand this issue from a Maine perspective very well. And then the 6 working groups were tasked with, starting from that science basis, developing recommendations for the council to consider as it develops its plan moving forward. So the 6 working groups, as I said, were working really hard over the last 8 months to absorb all of that knowledge, to listen to the stakeholders represented in those groups, to do some preliminary stakeholder engagement, and develop recommendations that would move Maine towards its goals, again, with eyes on cost effectiveness, equity, job creation, workforce benefits, all of the things that you see listed on the slide here. The work groups had participation from legislators, from industry members, from folks who represented groups who would be affected by climate change, and from groups who would be affected by the implementations of policies and programs that might come out of the Climate Council. So it was a really thoughtful composition of the working groups to try to include as many voices as possible. Admittedly, you can't include all of the voices. So we have some work to do over the summer to hear those groups, identify who we need to get input from, and Tony and I will talk about that a little bit later on this evening. as we said, the work groups presented their recommendations to the council last week in a series of meetings. These three working groups, building, infrastructure and housing, transportation and energy, really represent the working groups that were focused on how do we cut greenhouse gas emissions from various sectors in the state. And these are their recommendations. And I'm not going to read them all. You can see the bold type tries to get to highlight for you what some of the most important things were. But they're really thinking about things in a couple of buckets. One is efficiency. How do we make our cars, our buildings, even our generation, how do we make that more efficient? So we're using energy, less energy to do the same amount of work or even more work. How do we clean that energy supply so that we are feeding into the grid cleaner sources of energy that have lower greenhouse gas emissions, so that we can, in the third bucket, is electrify a lot of the things that happen in Maine. And that, as I mentioned, the heat pumps, that's one form of electrification, moving building heating from fossil fuel burning to electrified processes. If we can do that, and draw on clean energy sources, we're really getting a double win there for lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. There's a number of other ways in here that these working groups really tried to meet that goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the spectrum. And I will say that all of these recommendations it doesn't do it justice to just have these bullet points. There are pages and pages of context and detail and recommendations about equity and jobs and costs that you can find on our website, and we'll share that link with you in a moment. And then there were three working groups that were really focused on the resilience and adaptation side of the coin. How are we going to adapt communities and industry and folks and towns to deal with what we know is coming down the pike as far as more severe storms, hotter days, wetter weather, changes in ecosystems, changes in the resource-based economies. How is all of that going to think about, prepare for, and react to those changes? And so you'll see a couple of themes sprinkled out through these recommendations. Some of it is around updating the laws that are on the books, particularly our land use laws, for about where we develop, how we develop, where we choose to protect and conserve. There's also a number of topics in here that have to do with monitoring. How are we observing and keeping track of the changes? We can't change what we don't measure. So we need to know what's going on in as close to real time as possible so that we can make policy and react to those changes and try to anticipate what those changes are going to be. And then the third piece that's kind of a theme through here is using nature-based solutions, letting nature do a lot of the work for us and working in tandem with nature so that we're not only conserving and protecting, but building resilience in the way that nature knows how, and also building opportunities for recreation and open space so that folks are able to continue to enjoy the landscape that Maine has and allow it to work for us. So again, there's a ton of detail and cruising through this in a couple of minutes doesn't do justice to the weeks and months of work that was done for the last 8 months. And I would encourage you, if you want to dig in on any of these any deeper, to look at the reports that the working groups have put out, and we'll share that link. So this last slide, before we move on to the work coming up, was really an attempt to sort of let you know what's going on here around Portland and where it touches with the Climate Council. So these are not projects that were born out of the Climate Council. These are just examples of things underway already that the council is actually learning from. So one example is actually here in my neighborhood, the Wessex Woods Senior Affordable Housing Project that's going in right next to the Maine Girls Academy. They're building it, it's a 4-story building that they're building entirely out of cross-laminated timber. So there's very little concrete or steel that went into this building. It's using timber products, It's actually sequestering and storing carbon in the building through the use of wood products. So there's a number of wins that come out of this for not just for the developers in the building, but for the state. Obviously, cross-laminated timber could be a Maine produced product. The timber used in this building, I believe, comes from Montana, since we don't have enough of an industry here yet in Maine, but I think there's an opportunity to build that industry up. So using wood saved on building costs. You didn't have to build with concrete steel. You avoided the greenhouse gas emissions that come from creating concrete, which is actually a really greenhouse gas intensive activity. So there's definitely some environmental wins there. There's some cost savings for the developers, and there's potential here in cross-laminated timber for jobs that support the timber industry in Maine. The Bayside Anchor project over in the Bayside neighborhood of Portland is another affordable housing project. This building is built to passive house standards, which means it's a really, really high efficiency building, both in terms of the systems that go into the mechanical systems in the building are high efficiency, but the building envelope itself is really highly efficient at keeping heat in the winter. And so the energy use for this building is really quite minimal. And the heat loss in the winter is really quite minimal as well. So that actually helps keep the cost down for the residents and helps keep it keeps it affordable housing units. And then thirdly, the city of Portland is, I think, still in the process of considering a coastal resilience overlay zone that would have additional resilient building requirements and also provide developers with a height bonus for the building if they agree to and adhere to a number of those building requirements. For example, if they need to elevate the building out of a flood zone, they can get a height bonus that allows them to build the same number of floors, but makes it more resilient to flooding. So those are some examples from Portland. Again, these are not tied to the council, but they're the kinds of things that the council and the working groups have grappled with and thought about over the last couple of months. So here's the pivot to from where we've been over the last couple of months to where we're really going over the next 3 months during the summer. There are some analyses going on right now that are looking at the greenhouse gas models and the energy modeling to get a better grip on the costs and the cost efficiency or cost effectiveness of the strategies that are going to reduce greenhouse gases. So what is the cost in dollars per ton of carbon reduction? There's another analysis going on that's looking at the cost of doing nothing. If we choose to do nothing as a state, that's not free. It's not that it's not that that doesn't cost us anything. There will be recovery from storms. There'll be economic losses in agriculture, forestry, and fishing. So we're looking to quantify some of those costs and get a better idea of what the baseline is from where we're at. And then we're working with the George Mitchell Center at the University of Maine to do an equity assessment to understand how the recommendations that have been proposed by the working groups, how those do on an equity, with an equity lens, and where they can be improved so that we're meeting the needs of Maine's most vulnerable populations. We're being thoughtful about how we include as many voices as possible, especially the ones that are difficult to get at, so that those voices are included in the information that the Climate Council chews on as it develops its recommendations for policy. And then I'll turn it over here to Tony to talk about a lot of the exciting public engagement work that's going to be happening this summer.
All right, Brian, thank you. Thank you very much. That was an excellent overview of 9 months of work by hundreds of people into a very concise presentation. I just want to say a couple of things about the working group recommendations in light of the sort of the further analyses to come. Is that the working group recommendations emerged it began in an environment where the current pandemic wasn't a reality, right? And so the working groups continued to work through this process and arrive at their recommendations. And one of the things that we've had to come to as a staff and also as a council, and just thinking about how the current environment, affects this work. And one of the things that is abundantly clear is trying to understand that last bit there, the costs and benefits of all of these strategies, is going to be critically important, to see what we can do in a resource strapped environment, for state and local governments going forward. Where is the biggest bang for our buck, and that cost benefit analysis is going to be critical coming in later. Another part that we are really starting to understand is the impacts of things that were maybe not on the table when the Climate Council really started, the working groups really started talking about this. And one of them that I think is clear to everybody on this call is that we're on this call. So what is the impact of tele-everything on climate, on people's habits, on how people work and how people move? We simply don't know. We're in the middle of a grand social experiment on that now, but it certainly is something that we need to highlight. And it kind of highlights something that I think wasn't probably apparent at the beginning of the process, but is now. But things like broadband access, things like high-speed broadband in rural areas, they're an economic development imperative. They might also be a climate imperative to be able to sustain things like telehealth and teleworking and maybe even distance education, at some point for people. And so seeing these things through a climate lens is something that the current environment has really happened. And the last part is, I think, is the big one. It's the intersection of this work with also the kind of the economic recovery of the state and the economic future of the state. We're in a position to say, how do these recommendations, how does this work? How do we build back better? Which I think is the phrase that's going on now, to say, what part of this is going to really contribute to a robust and lasting economic recovery for Maine, which, again, when the council started its process last year to now, it just has become, I think, top of mind for a lot of people given where we are. So that's kind of my tee up to the public engagement process, and that's here. And again, this is something that has gone through several iterations if we've adapted to COVID. And so one of the things that we've done in pivoting the Climate Council process, the working group process, to an all virtual process, is that we needed a new virtual home for the Climate Council. So climatecouncil.maine.gov launched last week in time to the Climate Council meetings. It's a microsite devoted to the Climate Council public engagement work, but it's also meant to be kind of a one-stop shop for anybody who is either unfamiliar with the council, has not been part of the working groups, maybe has never heard of this thing before, can come here and get a good understanding of what this whole process is all about. And so thank you to the Island Institute and Tom Groening for our lovely header photo of Vinyl Haven with the wind turbines in the distance. It's sort of the perfect encapsulation of what we're talking about with Maine being a climate leader, and the kind of things that are really present all around our state now that show the promise and the potential of these sort of climate initiatives that are happening. It's real, and the ability to kind of see that as real and happening more often around the state is kind of the goal there. So climatecouncil.maine.gov is the first spot for that, and I encourage everybody to take a look. Starting in a couple of weeks, we're going to open up some engagement opportunities for the public to help inform what the council will be thinking about in its next meeting in September. And we're giving these a lot of thought about the kind of feedback we're asking from people for a couple of really important reasons. One, the council has spent a lot of time coming up with their recommendations, and we feel like, as an honor to their work and also to be commensurate, we want to come up with a thoughtful set of ways for people to be able to engage with them, read them, and tell us what you think, with an appreciation for some of the decisions the council is going to have to make, largely with the trade-offs that come in with any big policy work like we're doing here. So we are going to have these, we're going to have two versions of this. One is going to be some online forums and online engagement that are going to ask people to kind of react and help prioritize the recommendations of each of the working group. And then we're also working on a series of questions that are a little more open-ended about about perceptions of climate change in Maine, about perceptions where you feel climate change is may harm your community the most, or where you fear the effects of climate change may have the greatest effect in your community. And also just get a sense a little bit about what you're doing now to kind of address it. I mean, it'd be important for the council to know like what people are ready to do and are doing in their own behavior, as well as what they fear could happen absent action, to be able to inform the really challenging work that's going to come and going through these recommendations later on in the fall to come up with a climate action plan. So again, we're trying to do the work of the council justice by coming up with these thoughtful methods of reacting to the recommendations. And we're also going to have an offline toolkit because we feel like it's really an opportunity to have some offline materials so people can sit with them for a little bit, maybe talk to their family about it, maybe have a dinner conversation about some of the recommendations and kind of engage other people's thinking about it. Because the more thoughtful and deep understanding we can get, the more education we can do about the recommendations and the more thoughtful feedback we can get back, the better the work of the council is going to be to kind of help shape these strategies going forward. So it's no small feat, but we'll have those up in early July. And then we also, again, we're going to do more events like this all summer long. And so these are various opportunities to connect with the council. We are, currently on social media at Maine Climate Council on Twitter and Instagram. That it's run by two amazing interns we have this summer, Liz Theriault from Madawaska and Sarah Corkum from Chelsea, who are working together to kind of engage our social media effort and work on some of our engagement strategies all summer long. We have currently on the site 2 of these icons. 4 of them will come again when about the events, news, and the free webinar will come a little bit later in July. So this is a preview of coming attractions. But currently we have these invite the council and contact the council live on the website now. Contact the council goes to a form that allows you to fill out and direct any comment you have based filtered by working group. And it's the same form we've been using so far. It's worked incredibly well to now. And so if you are itching and eager to tell something to the council and want to highlight a certain working group recommendation, please go to that form, fill out the form and send it in. It's open 24/7, and please do. And on the site also right next to that is the invite the council to present to your group. Like we do want our outreach this summer to be both reaching out to people whose voices weren't heard, but we also invite any opportunity to come to a group who wants to learn more. And so we have a form up on our site now that's will trigger an email to us. So if you do want to learn about any specific topic, something general about the council, or really anything, let us know. We'll try to facilitate a presentation for your group. And that's pretty much the end of our presentation. The one thing I would like to highlight as well is we have a very large email sign-up form on our site. And because we have so many steps to go during the summer with the cost-benefit analysis, with the cost of doing nothing analysis, which I think is going to be fascinating when it comes out, some of the greenhouse gas modeling, we really want to facilitate a dialogue with the people who are interested in continuing to do that. And so if you leave your email address for us, we will keep you advised all summer long about not only the opportunities and the events we have to engage, but also to keep you apprised when these other key data points about climate in Maine come forward. So this work is ongoing. It's going to be happening all summer long. If you leave your email address with us, you'll be in the know. And why I think that's important too is that, we want to know what you think now, a month from now, maybe 2 months from now. Maybe there's something that has to do with the cost-benefit analysis that changes your mind or changes what your priorities are. All of this is important for us to know and important for the council to know going into September. This is not, and this is something, an appreciation I've really come to over my last 3 months working with the council, is that this stuff is complicated. It is hard. It is challenging to really get your mind around in any quick way. You have to be engaged with it. You have to be thinking about it. You have to be open to all these sort of inputs as they come along to help shape your opinion. I know I feel different about climate in Maine, and I think about climate in Maine different now than even when I started at GoPIF 3 months ago, just based on what I've learned. And so continuing this conversation is critical. We want you to do that. Please drop your email with us and we'll be able to continue to do that. So, and again, I want to thank the Portland Public Library for having us. I think we are here to, Brian and I can answer some questions. And I want to thank everybody for their attention. This is my first one of these, and thank you for sitting through it. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Brian. So I'm Jess Burton, and I'm the director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. And the Sustainability Series is a partnership we do with the Portland Public Library. We've been doing it for 4 years, and many of you have been to, a number of our presentations. And one of my goals coming from the conservation sector is to sort of broaden the conversation about conservation and sort of examine our role as in this sector of conservation in other issues that are super important and that intersect with our work. And we know there's an obvious connection between land conservation and climate adaptation and resilience. But it's not always a place where land conservation feels comfortable, because it often has in the past had to sort of move into an advocacy framework, which is not something we do at the front of our mind. But the council has has enabled a way to engage in this conversation on so many different levels and from so many different frameworks that I find myself talking about it as a person, that is living. I live on Peaks Island, and I can talk about it with my family, my friends, my kids, just everything. And then in my work, thinking about the intersection, the opportunities to share this work. And now we're at that place where everybody does need to get engaged. So I also want to acknowledge that we had set up to have this presentation in March. Our original date was March 25th, and the presentation was going to be very different, similar, but it was going to involve different people. And it was going to be in person. So we had to cancel that one. We moved quickly into the Zoom, and Brian and Tony were so great and flexible to work hard. I mean, this has all been just sort of happening. The recommendations were just last week. They just threw this together and did a beautiful job. It was a beautiful presentation and a great explanation. So I want to thank the both of you for leaning into this and providing us with this sort of, in some ways, like a launch of this program. So I feel honored in that way. And I want to thank Meg for being my partner in hosting these Zooms on the library Zoom channel. So thank you, Meg. You know that it's one of my favorite things in my job is to work with you in the library. So I see that we have some questions coming in on the chat, and we're going to now open up to questions. So number one, the IPCC says we are in a worse situation than we thought. So is 2045 still a laudable goal for carbon neutrality?
So it's a good question. And we know that there is a lot of urgency around the question of how quickly we need to decarbonize our economies and get the atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases under control. So I completely understand where this question is coming from. The challenge is to do that in a way that doesn't destabilize a lot of the systems that we rely on. And so there's a balance. It's entirely possible that we hit these targets ahead of schedule. But these are the targets that we have. These are the targets that have been set in law. And the Climate Council is charged with strategies that will get us to these targets by this timeline.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that one of the things that has struck me again in sort of jumping into this work over the last 3 months is I started at the beginning of the pandemic, and at the beginning of the pandemic, as the world was changing and things were shutting down, there was a lot of speculation about what the impact of a global economic slowdown was going to have on greenhouse gas emissions, what was going to be the impact of this rapid shift to remote work and telehealth and people not, traveling nearly as much. And then as we were getting ready for the Climate Council meetings, NOAA came out with some data that said, 2020 still would have a 99.9% chance of being one of the top 5 warmest years on record. And it's still 50-50 on whether it's going to be the warmest at all. And I'm reading this, and this is my own personal kind of take on this. And so I say, like, well, even though there was so much uncertainty around this year, these trend lines are still unsettling, they're still unchanged, and we have to have a goal to get us to carbon neutrality. And we can't move off anything too quickly. We can't be too reactive to things in the moment. We have to set our course, set our goal, and walk towards it. And to Brian's point, we could get there earlier. There's a lot of things that could happen between now and then. But if we don't have that, we are going to do this by then, it's going to be really hard to focus on the end result.
Great, thank you. Okay, the number 2 question: how do we get buy-in from climate non-believers? So our past governor LePage and our current president don't believe in the climate. So how do we get buy-in from people who are non-believers? You can't believe in science. I know that's just the term.
I think it's, I understand the question, and I think I would answer it this way: is that data and science is a common language. We have to rely on that to say, this is something that's whether we want to believe in the causes or not, or disagree over causes or not, or disagree over ways to address it. The science really tells us that there's a problem occurring here that we need to address, and that problem is independent of your political beliefs. It is independent of your opinion, and it's coming for us either way. And so the sooner we can, in a perfect world, we can set aside all our differences and move together. I think we all know we don't live in a perfect world, but I think one of the goals that I have in sort of discussing this is just trying to ground that reality for people to say, like, this is actually happening. And that grounding that reality, I think, comes in 2 ways. It's talking about the clear and present changes and impacts that climate change is happening on Maine right now, but also it comes with and this really struck me in talking to Brian in the presentation for this, is that cross-laminated timber is a climate change strategy, and an economic development strategy, and something that's really right for Maine to consider. And I think of that to say, again, the reality is that there's great opportunity in seizing in some of these opportunities that's good for the climate and good for other things as well. And I think the more value and the more reasons we can talk about going in these directions for the benefit of all, gets us further away from that belief, not belief conversation, and towards a pathway that helps us get to these really incredible goals pretty quickly. So I confess, for a period of time, I didn't know where I stood on some of this stuff. And you get exposed to it, you think about it, you talk about it, you internalize it yourself, you have your horizons broadened, and think about where those pieces are that really affect you. You have children, you see your children, and you all just sort of come around to it. And I think there's no one thing that will happen, but it is going to be the more conversation, the more opportunities are understood, and the more reality and science can tell us, I think are the keys to kind of galvanizing us on a path.
It's just to build on that, there's a really great body of work out of Yale University called their Program on Climate Change Communication. And they have spent much of the last 10 years trying to understand how people think about climate change and breaking them down into 6 categories, from the people who are very concerned on one end to the people who are dismissive or in denial of climate change on the other end. And there's really a lot of middle ground there. So there's a lot of nuance to people's beliefs about climate change, and it's not as easy as believers and non-believers. So I'd point folks towards that. And if I can dig the link up before the end of this meeting, I'll throw it in the chat. So I'd encourage folks to dig into that and understand some of that nuance. The good news is that I believe in Maine, the polling is in our favor. Something like 70 or 75% of Mainers are somewhat concerned or very concerned about climate change. So that is a good signal for the direction that the Climate Council is moving in. We do have some work to do. We're never going to get everybody on board, but we would like to be able to boost those numbers up even higher.
Great, thank you. Another question, is an update to the Maine State Building Code part of the plan, like a net zero stretch code?
So part of the plan, not yet. The plan hasn't been written yet. At this point, we're dealing with recommendations from the working groups, and the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group did consider the MUBEC building codes for the state. There is a recommendation in there that I'll point you towards. I don't recall exactly what it says, but I think it does move towards more energy efficiency in buildings and getting Maine's building codes in line with international building codes.
The recommendations that Brian went through are drafts to the council. And so the council is really going to be making decisions and going through those drafts and understanding what ends up in the final climate action plan. But the working groups are really charged with coming up with, all the strategies that they could build consensus around and really bring forward as needing to be considered. So there's still a lot of work to go to kind of get to a final plan.
Are there other ways the public could get engaged other than what was talked about in the presentation?
Absolutely. I mean, we're open to any ideas. Again, I'd use the contact form to let us know. One of the things we've really had to put our mind around is that the traditional method of doing engagement like this is in person. It's not through screens like this. And we recognize that, for example, I have a great fear that this summer that we're all going to have Zoom fatigue, especially when the weather gets nice, and that we're going to try to do a lot of virtual engagement that people are just not going to be there for. So, if there is, I would love to talk to people with good ideas about engaging their friends, engaging their family to kind of give the kind of actionable feedback we're looking for, and to be ambassadors for this process. And so I would encourage you to reach out to us and let me know what you're thinking. But, right now what we have planned is sort of the online and the offline opportunities. We are going to be doing direct engagement to certain groups that have been identified that weren't able to be either part of a process up until now due to COVID-related interruptions. But we're open to any ideas about how to best reach people, especially if you're interested in helping us with this process along.
I like that term, ambassadors. I was imagining when you were describing the things that are coming out in July, like people just look at and have like group conversations either in their workplace or with their family, as you said, friends. So that's a really cool. And so thinking about that as like a, if that's something that you're when you said that, ambassador, if that actually you have a plan around that, like is someone in your office going to maybe be able to manage ambassadors and support ambassadors and maybe even provide stipends to ambassadors to ensure that they're able to work in their community in different ways. So that's I like that term. That works really well.
If there's movement behind it and there are people that are engaged in wanting to do that kind of work, we're definitely open to considering it.
That's really cool. We had a question a little further back. Is the climate action plan available to the public? I think that's what is being worked on now, right?
That's correct. The Climate Action Plan is the final product of the Climate Council, and that's going to come out in December. So right now, the raw materials of the Climate Action Plan are the working group recommendations that came out last week that Brian reviewed. All of those are available in their raw form right now on climatecouncil.maine.gov. And to Brian's point, they're pretty lengthy. They're pretty in depth. The resilience working group that you were on, Brian, your working group was resilience, public health, and emergency management. And each one of those, resilience, public health, and emergency management, has their own series of deep recommendations. And so one of the things that we're working on now are some ways to synthesize these recommendations into some forms. We are going to have individual videos of the Climate Council presentations that from last week that people can watch it and so they can watch the recommendations as opposed to going through, what could be a pretty detailed set of PDFs. And those will be up in early July too, as part of the engagement process. But the climate action plan is the final product. We're still 5 or 6 months away from that.
It's important to note that the process is happening in a very public way. So all of the work group meetings over the last 8 months have been open to observation from the public, and in many cases took some comments from the public during those meetings when there was time. The council meetings, which happened last September, happened in January, happened last week, will happen in September, and will happen in November, are all open to observation from the public. So this has been a very transparent process and one that has been designed from the start for the public to be able to keep an eye on and know what's going on. And so a lot of the outreach that we're doing this summer is in that spirit.
Okay, awesome. Okay, a couple more questions. Is that cool to ask a couple more?
Yeah.
Are you good? How will the climate action plan intersect with local efforts such as One Climate Future, which is the Portland, South Portland initiative?
That's a good question, and we'll answer that with an example. We had a phone call with the folks from Portland and South Portland a couple of weeks ago as we were, actually it was longer than a couple of weeks ago now, but as we were designing this outreach for the summer, because Portland went through and still is going through a fairly extensive outreach process with website and surveys. I've seen flyers and posters and ways to interact with the process up around town. So we have wanted to learn from that process what worked well. And so we've engaged with them. There's some discussions going on the modeling side to make sure that the models are using consistent assumptions, and where they're not consistent, that we understand why those assumptions are different between the two efforts. So there is some crosstalk going on there, and making sure that we're understanding and learning from what each other is doing. So I'm not going to say or make any commitment to that the plans are going to be totally in alignment or have that level of interaction, but there's definitely dialogue and learning between the two processes going on.
Yeah, and we certainly hope groups like One Climate Future can help us with the engagement process this summer, and sort of tap into their networks and tap into their folks and share what they've learned and what they've come up with to help inform the Climate Council's work later on this fall.
That's great. Yeah, they presented here twice for the sustainability series, so it's really cool. Okay, after the
sounds like we need to come back then.
Yes, you do. Yeah, we're gonna hold you to it every year, an update. Actually, that has to do with my question, but I'm gonna hold my question until I ask you this one. After the plan comes out, how soon will we expect to see legislative actions?
I don't think neither Brian nor I are in a position to predict.
Hopefully soon, right? Yep. Like that. No,
yeah, I mean, I think hopefully soon. I mean, but lawmaker support is going to be critical to the success of this plan.
And so my question is about sort of the longevity of this project. Like in some ways, this feels like a sprint. Because it's the first year, it's the first action plan, it's like this whole new way in office. but it's the whole sort of framework for this is that it will be here to stay, and that this action plan will be updated in 4 years. Is that right? So I guess my question is, is there a process in place to collect lessons to address the next time and sort of either evaluate and change as you go, or think about the next time that the council is being called together and having all these working groups?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think, I know, speaking for myself, have really been invested in stewarding this process to its conclusion before thinking about the next 4-year cycle. But I mean, I think the intentionality around the creation of this is that it is an ongoing process, and that we will learn from it and will continue to keep the focus on climate and climate related issues going forward. And that's why it's enshrined in law.
How will the clean energy corridor contribute toward these target goals?
I don't know. I don't know enough about the clean energy corridor to really answer that question. That's out of my purview, unfortunately. I don't know.
Thanks. Sometimes that's just what we have to say, right? I
don't
know.
I don't know.
Great. Well, there are no more questions in the chat box, so I just want to thank you so much. And what I would just encourage everyone to do is spend some time on the website for the Climate Council. It's an excellent website. It has just amazing resources, so much information. And then to consider, your role in spreading the good word and getting more and more people involved, giving feedback, telling your story, reaching out to potentially be an ambassador. And Brian and Tony are, available. So thank you. Thank you both so much for joining us. And thanks everybody for spending your evening with us.
Yeah, thank you everybody. It's been really great. Thanks so much.
Hope to see you on September in the Rhines Auditorium. Take care.
Yes.
Bye-bye.